budget. I only to say to welcome the leader of the KPMG team, Elias George, and I will leave it to Elias to sort of conduct the rest of the session. I leave the formatting and how he wants to go about it. But since we have participants from not only from TiE Kerala, but also from TiE Chennai as well as TiE Coimbatore, I would introduce Elias. Otherwise, for the Kerala team and even for the Tamil Nadu team, Elias must be a known person. But a quick introduction. Today, Elias is the national head of the infrastructure, government and healthcare practice in KPMG, India, based out of Mumbai. So which offers a range of services and knowledge products across the entire gamut of government as well as in the areas of hard infrastructure, which is very, very critical, which has come out quite well in this year's budget. Social infrastructure, invisible infrastructure, public and private healthcare. I think if you really look at it, I think Nirmal has selected the right people to talk about it, because we're talking about infrastructure and healthcare, which has got a major outlay being done in this current budget. Prior to joining KPMG in India, Elias worked around 35 years in the Indian Administrative Service, occupying senior leadership position ranging from, as is typical with IAS officers, urban development to transportation, shipping, energy, water resources, industry and labor. In his last posting in the government, I think it was very noteworthy about Metro, Cochin Metro, which incidentally also got additional outlay of about close to 1,900 crores in the phase 2, which is called the Pink Line, going from Palarivattam to the Info Park, 11-kilometer line, which is allotted 1,900 crores. So he was heading the Kochi Metro Rail Limited prior to joining KPMG, the Cochin Smart Mission Limited, the Cochin Metro Transport Authority, which also started combining the kind of unified transport agency for the city, with a combined project size of around INR rupees 110 billion. His responsibilities have included serving as a government board in the boards of companies like Steel Authority of India Limited, Rashtriya Ispat Nigam Limited, Cochin Shipyard, and the chairman of Kerala State Electricity Board and chairman of Kerala Water Authority. So I would leave, and he is also a charter member of TiE Kerala, because we have a long association going between KPMG and TiE Kerala. So with these words, Elias, I would hand over the floor to you to conduct rest of the proceedings. I have specifically requested, since we have a fairly good gathering of startup and young entrepreneurs who are in this, and that's our our audience primarily, to spend some time on the budget and its implications on the startup ecosystem. So over to Elias. So I look forward to coming at the end of the talk. Over to Elias.
So thanks, MSA, for those generous words, and it's really good to be back with the TiE colleagues again. As you said, we've had a long association between KPMG and TiE going back over the years. We do those events together, and we are constantly in touch. So it's good to be back. Now, especially today's discussions are around the context of the budget which came out 2 days ago. It's always the fate of national budgets to get mixed reviews. But I think on this one, everyone, even the most severe critics, have found not too much to criticize about the budget. I was scanning the international media. Apart from an article today in the New York Times, generally it's been an upbeat reviews everywhere across the board. So that's really good to know, and I think they hit all the right notes. And if you look at what is called the foundational philosophy of the budget, they've mentioned 6 pillars are there, but I think there are 2 basic axes on which the budget has been constructed. One is on healthcare. And healthcare is the projects and the thoughts and the initiatives around healthcare have been informed by 2 realizations. One is that without upping the public healthcare quotient, not just in terms of individual health outcomes for people, improving them, but also in terms of surveilling the community against pandemics using digital tools, etc., we will not be in a good place. And that is one thing the public policy needs to focus on to improve people's well-being and lifestyles and livelihoods. That's one of the foundational philosophies of the budget. Second realization is that healthcare is the foundation on which economic prosperity is built. And if India wants to migrate to an 8% growth path, you have to ensure healthcare provision for all. And so that has been a very encouraging, exciting part of the budget. As we all know, about 2.3 trillion Indian rupees have been devoted to public healthcare. Immediately, one of the criticisms about Indian public policy over the last 40, 50 years is that we've been spending about 1% of the GDP on healthcare. Suddenly, it's gone up to 2.3% in one budget, and that's a revolutionary leap. So that would, I say, is one thing we need to keep in mind. The second one is the whole Keynesian pump priming, which has gone into the infrastructure piece. Again, as we know, they're setting up that dedicated financial institution, the DFI, for funding infrastructure. We've had troubles with funding infrastructure in the recent past. All that story about how some of these non-banking financial institutions like IL&FS collapse, etc. So long story short, they are putting in 20,000 crore into setting up this institution, and they got a very audacious goal that in 5 years, this will catalyze 5 trillion rupees worth of infrastructure in this country. Huge ambition there. A lot of other measures. Again, they've upped the capital expenditure on infra projects by about 36%. Initiatives in railways, waterways, ports. I don't want to go into the details. So these are the two basic pillars on which the budget has been built. Very, the best reaction to a budget is what the stock market does, because it's a crowdsourced wisdom of thousands of people, at least at the top half of the pyramid. The way the indices surged is an indication of how well the budget has been received by the people of this country. Again, since most of the people in this call, a lot of them are from Kerala. Kerala has been very blessed with this budget. We got a triple bonanza on roadways, 65,000 crore for improving the national highway, the economic zone around the Cochin Fishing Harbour, Kochi Metro extension to Kakinada, about 2,000 crore, and also some kind of policy approval for the high-speed line between Kerala and spanning Kerala from north to south. This is going to provide an enormous fillip to economic activity in the whole of the state. So that's where we stand. Long story short, I think this kind of incentivization of economic activity, starting the engine again, will be a key factor in putting India back into the growth path and restoring the 10% of GDP or whatever which has been lost by the pandemic. I don't want to take too much time here. We're very pressing agenda today. There can be no better lineup than the folk from KPMG on the call today. In no particular order, we have Prasad Unnikrishnan, who many of you know. He's our partner in Kerala and Bangalore, particularly focusing on aspects like healthcare and tourism, which will go very well with that startup approach that MSA and team wanted. He's here, you know him. He will start off the proceeding. So the way it's been planned is first we'll do the sectors, and then we'll go on to two of our stars who will advise you on basically the direct and indirect taxes. That's the way we planned it. So then we have Amit Kumar, who's a partner in our business consulting part. He's a specialist on food processing and agriculture with a digital flavor. So he'll talk about the industry of particular interest to a lot of people on this call. We have Ayla Bansal, who's a very leading member of my team, working very closely with the Ministry of Tourism and hospitality sectors. He'll cover that part very well. And you know how important it is for South India and Kerala in particular, that kind of a sector. We have a very senior partner on the call today, Mr. Sachin Menon. He's a leader in the firm. He's a highly respected authority across the country on indirect tax. We spoke about the IRS a little earlier. I've seen many IRS colleagues of mine lauding the kind of talent he brings to that wisdom and knowledge he brings to indirect tax. You're really lucky to have Sachin Menon on the call today. Likewise, Krishnan Narayanan, who's basically into direct tax, again, a very senior partner. He's been with the firm for 20 odd years. So I think you've got a stellar lineup both on the sectors as well as on the taxation, which will be of general interest to everybody on the call. So without much ado, we'll start the proceedings. And going by the order which has been given by Tai to me, over to you, Prasad, for starting off on the sectors that you represent. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, and that was a very nice introduction. The best way I could see the entire budget summed up in just 5 minutes, giving the entire gamut of all the things which has already come out. And thank you all for giving KPMG the opportunity to come up on this session to give a post-budget session on how we are looking at this budget from the various perspectives and sectors. I would look at from the perspective of startup as well as the small companies and a little bit on technology per se in that side. Before I start, I hope most of the time members would be remembering what we were discussing last time, maybe May 2020 during the COVID-19 impact. And we were looking at what are the measures which are required by startups themselves or as a community like GTech and Thai Kerala, etc., on looking at how and when and why, what should be the various aspects of a budget or the financial thing which you should do. And if you remember, I don't know how many of you remember those 4 points which you mentioned as KPMG. One was financial resilience, the other was regulatory resilience, third was operational resilience, and the fourth was commercial resilience. I'm not showing any slides here, okay, apologies for that, but I'm just saying, because if you, Elias George mentioned about the basic pillars on which the larger budget was prepared, we were talking about certain 4 pillars on which how the startups and the small IT companies and other things should actually look at. Now, when I look at the larger ecosystem and the way the budget has been conceived today, I would say these 4 pillars which we discussed in May 2020 has been in one way or the other actually absorbed in this budget in a very beautiful manner. And that's where the beauty of the statements in a budget actually turns the economy into a bubbling kind of a system. Okay, so let me just tell you, I'll give you a broad outline of what the entire startup ecosystem in the country is all about. So for example, it is actually providing jobs to around 4.7 lakh people. It's one of the largest to actually provide jobs. In addition, we are the third largest ecosystem of startups in the world. And looking at these two aspects, you should understand the importance of this particular sector. Adding to that, if you look the way things are happening today, the tech is primarily driven by the startups. And going forward, everything going digital, the employment is also going to be driven by startups. So these were the two ideas. If I look at the budget, the way they have conceived it is the major 2 points on which the budget has been made. So let me explain to you what are the key things which I could see as the best part of this budget from the startup perspective. So first is about, if you ask me, that 1% company, and that's a beautiful concept, I would say aligned to an Atmanirbhar Bharat, will now be able to grow without any restriction on the paid up capital or a turnover like. So this will further allow us to convert. They are also allowed to convert this company in any other company at any point of time. My tax experts will come back to me exactly on those kind of things. But what I could conceive is that it is going to actually introduce entrepreneurship as a way for employment in the country. And this will take this entrepreneurship to the grassroots level. So if I could decipher a little bit more on that, what it is trying to say is the threshold for paid up capital from 50 lakhs to 2 crores and the turnover from 2 to 20 crores is actually going to benefit more than 2 lakh companies for their easing compliance requirements in the country. So that is going to be a game changer, primarily from the perspective of employment generation through entrepreneurship. So that is the message the government is trying to do. That's one. The second is about another beautiful thing, okay, and that's where I think you should understand the way how the startup ecosystem is creating. That's the thing which I caught up in this particular budget. So basically, if you see the social security benefits to gig and platform workers, many of us don't realize that the startups actually is supported by a larger ecosystem of people who generate employment. There are certain benchmarks when we say about employment in a construction industry. One particular 1:15 is the secondary employment created. But in startups, such benchmarks have not been done till date. But if you see a model of Ola, Uber, Swiggy, or Zomato, how many people are actually delivering food to your homes on a day? These are called the gig workers or the platform workers. Now, are they getting salary? They're not getting any salary. So what is the incentive for them to actually support this kind of a business? And that is where the social security benefit to these people are being introduced. And that is another way actually to create more of those kind of startups, which will actually work wonderfully and create larger ecosystem, again, creating employment in this case. Okay, so these are all very minor way of putting it out, but the impact is going to create on the entrepreneurship model as well as the employment getting generated is huge. Okay, so these are two first striking points which I could see in this budget. In addition to it, a couple of other things as well, the tax expert would go in deep, but I would just say, if you remember in May 2020, when we discussed on the financial resilience part of the startups, one of the things was the regulatory compliance burdens, wherein extending the eligibility for claiming tax holiday was an issue at that time. Now the government has extended it to March 2022, which is much needed to actually mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and offering a safety net to the newly incorporated small business and little startups. So that is again another way of actually supporting and boosting these kind of companies. One more point which I want to say, I missed it out on the OPC side, and that's again important. It's about the NRIs being allowed to come and do a shop, set the shop in the country. And this is something basically because they have reduced that 182 days to 120 days for the OPCs to come and do, for the OPC, for the overseas residents to do it. So that's another thing which they are doing. One of the other beautiful concepts, I don't know how will it shape up later, but this is something which we can look at from that perspective. I hope you know the GIFT City Gandhinagar. So there's a small mention about new tax incentives proposed for units under the IFSC GIFT City Gandhinagar. Now, what does it mean? This is an idea which the government has been trying to enable for quite some years now. Okay. Now, this move will actually bring in international funding to relocate from India in a hassle-free manner. So what it means is this funding is also will be available tomorrow for the startups or the VCs who are supporting these kind of an industry or small and medium industry, etc. That is also a wonderful move which they have tried to do. So these are all the major things if I see from the larger perspective, primarily from the perspective of a startup, overall from the perspective of budget. Now, in addition to it, they have also mentioned 2-3 things where a little bit of clarity is required. One is about the apprenticeship law. The old Apprenticeship Act, which we have all seen. I don't know, all of us would have actually, sitting on this panel, would have actually done some or the other apprenticeship in some companies. It was actually, I always think that was the first model of a startup wherein you are given an exposure and people could actually come out and do something. Well, at that point of time, the concept of startup was not there, but we only took it as an industry experience. But the same thing is being adopted today as a startup model by incubation by the government. So that is going to change a little bit. So more clarity is required, but that is going to be game changing if they're going to do it in a different way. One more thing which I want to say from the perspective of the entire ecosystem of startup and industry is the labor reforms. So while labor reforms were having multiple acts and rules, now it's confined to 4 major codes, which is primarily reduce the burden on the compliance from the perspective of the industry as well as for the employees. So these are the major highlights, which I would say are the game changers for this budget to support the small industries as well as for the startups. I think that's from my side at this point of time. Over to you. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Prasad. We'll take questions together at the end. So moving on, in the interest of time, we have Alap Bansal on tourism and hospitality. Over to you, Alap.
Thank you, Elias, and good evening to everybody. Just to set the context, this has been one of the worst years as far as tourism industry is concerned. The pandemic hit tourism first, and I think it will be one of the last industries to recover from it. The fact is that global tourism is down by about 70%, which has brought us back to about 30 years ago. So that is what we're looking at. In light of this, largely what we've seen is a shift to domestic tourism. India's domestic tourism has always been very, very resilient. In fact, during 9/11, during the tsunami, the SARS pandemic, even the recession of 2008, the domestic tourism was very, very buoyant, and that is what has carried forward the industry. So in that context, the central government had an opportunity to present a budget this year. And the challenge that the central government had was very, very simple. Everybody wanted incentives, everybody wanted tax ops, but we had a year where the government did not have revenue for most of the year, right? 2020 was not a very good year for the government as well. So the government had to focus on being financially and fiscally prudent, whereas also, driving long-term benefits and long-term reforms as far as any sector was concerned. And being such a critical year, I think the government has rightly concentrated on 3 sectors: health, agriculture, and public infrastructure. That has been the thrust of this budget, no matter how you read it. Most of the tourism industry, unfortunately, was slightly disappointed that there were no short-term measures and short-term incentives given in the budget. But I would like, all of you to think about it from a broader perspective. Think about it from a larger theme. And the larger theme is that the government has taken a long-term view on the tourism sector. And I'll tell you why. See, the support which is being offered is towards the core industry, which is what drives the tourism industry. The tourism industry is not only the hotels, hospitality, it is a larger ecosystem which drives tourism, right? For example, the aviation sector, which has been given tax incentives, which includes tax holiday for capital gains on aircraft leasing companies. tax exemptions for lease rentals paid to foreign investors. So these are some of the incentives which have gone into aviation. We also know that there's a huge drive for privatization of the aviation industry at large, which is going to drive more and more people to tier 2 and tier 3 towns where the airports are being developed. Also, as Prasad mentioned, the entire discussion around the IFSCs in the GIFT City is going to drive a lot of money into the infrastructure. So attracting foreign funds in infrastructure, which is eventually going to lead to development of tourism, is another key theme that we can see in this entire budget. The outlay for national highways, in fact, in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Assam, the development of that entire corridor from Bombay to Kanyakumari is going to help us in getting more and more people access to destinations which were not already on the map. Future ready railway system is another, I think, a very good concept. In fact, the government is also looking at Vista Dome railway coaches on all tourist routes, which is automatically going to become a tourist attraction by itself. So the idea is that all of this will eventually lead in driving tourism sector. Now, if we read the budget and we see that, you know, there is a thrust towards health, and we see that about 11,000 rural and urban health centers will be upgraded, we would think that that doesn't impact tourism. What I would like to bring out here is that that also drives something which is very, very well known now, especially in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, which is wellness tourism. So there is a larger idea that the government has pushed as far as the tourism sector is concerned. Also, something which was very, very, you know, enlightening for us and very, very happy for me was that there is an allocation of about 20,000 crores for tourism infrastructure alone in the national infrastructure pipeline. This is in addition to infrastructure which drives tourism. So in addition to roads, ports, airways, rural, all of that set aside, tourism itself is going to get about 20,000 crores of allocation from that infrastructure pipeline. So we understand that the government is actually looking at it from a very, very long-term perspective. And I do strongly believe that the policy makers have thought about it in detail. And if the industry comes together as a resilient industry and shows the amount of benefit that we've been providing to the nation as a whole, I'm sure that, you know, next year, given the amount of revenue that the government is going to generate, there may be some shorter term incentives which are rolled out. You know, Kerala is a brilliant example of cooperative development in the tourism sector. And I think that is something that Kerala should teach to the entire country on how can we come together and, you know, take this sector forward. As a parting note, you know, I would also think that all of us put together, especially the startups which are here today, should think of how do we do data collection and how do we manage data in the tourism industry. A large part of the benefit that tourism provides to the nation is derived from, you know, indirect sources, and the data collection in itself is very, very poor. If we can come out together as an industry with a solution which gives robust data on, you know, nation building and the amount of job creation and economic activity that tourism generates, I think the larger perspective around the budget and the larger perspective of the policymakers in this sector is going to improve. As somebody was mentioning, you know, agriculture and construction generates 11 times of economic activity. Tourism generates about 40 times of economic activity. So this is a sector that I think is there for the long run. And I do believe that this budget has actually taken that view. And on the back of all this infrastructure development, we should see a major growth in tourism, especially on the domestic tourism side. Back to you, Elias.
Thanks, Alap. We move on to know the agriculture and food processing sector, where our senior partner Amit Kumar will talk to you. Must also say he brings some very niche capabilities around digital transformation in these sectors. I don't know whether he's going to touch upon it, but it's maybe useful to know.
Thanks. Thanks, Elias. Just a quick check. I hope I'm audible.
Indeed, you are. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks, Elias. Afternoon, everyone. For a change, I'll try to present from a slide deck, and some of the content out there is broadly what we have from the budget in terms of numbers and how we are seeing those numbers. And I'll add that the commentary from my side in terms of how we see these allocations from the budget and the the perspective from the government affecting the startup universe in the country. Like Ilyas mentioned, I also focus on digital. So there would be some peppering of the AgTech sector related content also in what I talk. Very quickly moving to the core of what we get from the budget. There are 3-4 areas within the budget that the finance minister talked about very effusively. She did mention that there is substantial focus on agri-allied sectors. In particular, food processing honestly did not get that much mention, but we have tried to sort of get some dope for that also for the audience on this call. So first thing, most importantly, in terms of putting the money where the mouth is, the overall allocation for the sector has grown up only nominally by about 2%, and give or take a couple of 1,000 crores here or there. Some accounting can be done in different numbers, but broadly the overall allocation has gone up by about 2%. However, when you read through the details, there's a good mix of clarity around where the government wants to increase the spending and where the government is looking at rationalizing the spending going on. So, for example, there is a higher focus on farmer welfare, spend on R&D, etc., especially under the Department of Agriculture, and on promoting co-ops. And these are areas where the allocations have gone up by 5% or more overall in the scheme of things. Also, for the Fasal Bima Yojana and price stabilization schemes, the allocations have moved in different directions. So Fasal Bima, the allocations have gone up. Price stabilization, it has gone down. While at the same time, under the green scheme, more categories are getting covered. Now, before I move on, one quick take on how this affects some of the aspects. In terms of supporting some of the startup and AgTech companies, there is a substantial focus on how the R&D budget will be spent. And there are admin processes laid out wherein startups that assist in specific areas, for example, agri-insurance or agri-R&D and all, they can access schemes from the government. So that's something that the government has laid out in its fine print. One of the big spends on the agri side for the government has always been the fertilizer subsidy. Overall, if we look at the subsidy allocation, the quantum has gone down for the overall budget level. And within that also, if we see on the urea side, the allocations have been going down. The government has budgeted for clearing all the outstanding dues for fertilizer companies. But overall, the intent is very clear. Going forward, chemical fertilizers are increasingly an area where the government is trying to reduce its spend. Again, tying it back now to where the opportunities lie. We already understand there are players in the country and there are organizations which are looking at setting up niche crop nutrition solutions. It could be chemical fertilization, it could be non-chemical, organic, or what they call biofertilization, as well as crop stimulation chemicals and so on. Those are areas where startups can start seeing more traction in the market because the funding is moving from pure fertilizer subsidy to direct benefit where the government is allocating more of the money. Moving on quickly, the agri credit target has increased, and more importantly, it has included now the companies in the fisheries, dairy, animal husbandry, and related sectors. So startups in these sectors particularly have now the access to these funds that the government is earmarking and actively encouraging the agencies to extend loans for. On the PM Kisan side, the total allocation has increased, and this is one of the highest increases across all the allocations we see. While per person, the amount has remained the same as last year, which is about 6,000 rupees. The total allocation has gone up by 15%. Again, taking a cue from this, what is important is how can you get into value-adding activities, because the farmer, rather than getting subsidy on specific products, is getting cash in his bank. How do you add value to the agri chain, including the dairy, fishery, and all that, to reach out to the farmer and get this funding, this part of cash release in the market to new value proposition is something that is opening up for the startups. The AIDC cess that has been added, the Agriculture Infra Development cess, that is one area which, if you read the fine print, it makes sense for especially the platform type of companies or the buyer supplier matchmaking kind of companies to come up and leverage this infra that the government is setting up. Moving on, some details out there on the slides. Maybe I'll get this mailed out. But a couple of key points. There's much higher outlay for FPOs, again, one of the largest increases. There's integration proposed for about 1,000 mandis with ENM. And again, these two are areas where there's a lot of work that agtech companies, especially those trying to link farmer and crop produce information with the consumer side of things, can leverage what is coming up and the linkage between ENAM and the consumer side substantially. Another thing I would want to point out, the Swamitva scheme, wherein the tech aspect is being used to increase the coverage of mapping of villages, soil, cultivation patterns, and so on. If we see globally, there's a lot of work that firms do in this domain, doing geospatial mapping, overlaying it with crop information, and then using that for insurance, seeds, chemical crop protection, and so on. That's a space which is still sort of less leveraged in India, largely owing to the poor quality data on the rural land ownership and land related information side. This is something that will get mapped and get activated by the focus that government is giving to this area. One last thing I would want to point out, I talked about this, the Operation Green scheme. This is possibly the closest that comes to something in the budget for the food processing industry. So this has been expanded to cover 22 perishable commodities now, and the benefits of the scheme can be had across the value chain for these commodities, from sowing, harvesting to processing. So that's one area that the members here can focus on. That's probably what I wanted to cover. Thanks a lot. Back to Ilyas.
Thanks so much, Amit. We've covered the sectors now, and we move on to the part which is of interest to everyone. It's the taxation part. I'd invite our very senior partner, Sachin Menon, to speak about the indirect tax implications of the budget now.
Thank you, Ilyas. Am I audible?
You are, Sachin, very clear. Go ahead.
Thank you. So essentially, this year, everybody was having a sigh of relief looking at the budget, saying that there is no new taxes. Then the question came that, then what is this AIDC cess, the Agriculture Infra Development cess? Now, whether this is an additional tax or not. Then the finance minister clarified that no, this levy of agricultural infrastructure cess, development cess, is not going to increase the total tax content in any of those 25 items on which this is levied. Then the question is that if it is not making any extra revenue, why you are making this AIDC cess? Anyway, you are imposing this new cess on the taxpayers. So the answer is that when cess is imposed on any of those goods or services, as per the constitution, cess utilization has a requirement that any cess collected should be defined that where are you going to spend this cess collected, and if you are not using that fund for the purpose of what is specified in the law when you are imposing the cess, then that cess cannot be used for anything else. So she wants to bring a focus spend on the agricultural sector, and for the purpose of accommodating the cess, all the imported items, the customs duty has brought down by 2.5%, and the cess is levied on all those items which is subject to this agriculture cess. So much so better. So essentially, if you look at the budget takeaways, the measures are prima facie and predominantly is simplifying the compliance requirement under the GST law, especially GST law and customs law. For example, the e-invoicing mechanism, and then government is going to make the return for you, automatic filling up of returns. So you have the GSTN account will have a return pre-filled, a GSTR 3B pre-filled, which is editable, and you need to only add those information which is not captured. And similarly, now the input tax credit availment is earlier was restricted, not restricted, they are allowing you that in the cases where you are purchasing the goods from a vendor, you paid the tax and received the goods, you received the taxable invoice, but the seller has not declared this the sales in the GSTR1 return, which he is supposed to file every month. But you have received it, accounted in the purchase register, so there is a mismatch that in your purchase register, the credit is much higher, whereas the return filed by the supplier is not showing your invoice. So government has given some kind of a relief earlier that if there is a mismatch between the ITC statement in the GSTN portal and your purchase register, in that case, you can go up to 120% of the amount shown in the GSTN portal as entitlement credit, but not more than 120%. For example, if your credit in the purchase register is 130 and the government portal, GSTN portal showing it as 100, then you can claim up till 120 as the credit for that month and set off the your tax liability against the credit you are availed at 120%. That 20% leverage which they are given is reduced to 10% later and 5% from 1st of January. And now with this budget from the date is getting effective, your input tax credit would be restricted to the input tax credit shown in the GSTN portal. There is no allowance, which means that you have to be more cautious about buying from any of those suppliers who are not declaring the sales in their return. So it is one of this mechanism. And again, as you might have seen now, there is a increased surveillance on the activities, the commercial activities of the seller and buyer. The government is using analytics, artificial intelligence to identify the tax evaders and fake billing, etc. And nowadays, if anybody is arrested on the basis of any fake bill or any kind of tax evasion, even courts are not giving any kind of bail. There are about 200 plus people who are already behind the bars, which includes a few accountants by profession. So they are tightening the screw on the evasion of tax. And again, the inverted duty structure in some of the industries, such as agriculture, such as fertilizers, such as textile or pharma industry, etc., where the input tax rate is higher than the output tax liability, and therefore there is a trapped credit, which the government is assured that they are revisiting those rates, and they will see that there is no inverted duty structure in the GST regime. There is customs duty rationalization, and mainly this increase is in the taxes in the customs duty, and it is aimed at restricting the import of raw materials or finished goods which are manufactured in India. In other way, it is giving a protection to the domestic manufacturing industry, and also that whatever maybe the rationalization they have done, some of the cases they reduced it, so that India will essentially those inputs or raw materials which are not available, not manufactured in India, they have slashed the rate to some extent. So essentially, to make India a global manufacturing hub and bring a spot for India for the global value chain in the global supply chain scenario. And again, there are about 400 odd customs notification is getting reviewed. And because these are the notifications which are existing for years together, some of them lost its relevance. So the government is planning to go through each of them and resign many of them, which is not required. And this is supposed to happen from 1st of October 2021. As I already told you about the AIDC says, so the government is taken care that that is not impacting the consumers. Many items, the customs duty has been slashed, and those items, which is one of the important items, which is perhaps much more matter of interest to Kerala, is the gold, which is the customs duty is reduced almost by 5%. This is essentially looking at the increase in the smuggling activities, etc., to discourage that. The government seems to have done this, the reduction in the rate. And again, the customs notification, when they are issued, there are so many custom notification which is issued, which is lived its life and still continuing, and the officers are using it to some point in time hurt the importers. So now a new rule which are coming into existence to say that customs duty exemption will automatically expire from the date of notification. If that expiry date falling before 31st March of any year, then till the 31st March of that year, it will have validity, which means that notification will have a sunset clause, which can have a life of only 2 years unless it is extended or renewed. And again, now another initiative in the way of digitization of the entire tax compliance process, like GSTN portal, the government is going to launch a common customs electronic portal where you can do all the activities related to the import and export, which are like filing of bill of entry, shipping bills, registration of any import export registration, service of notice, issuance of show cause notices, order or summons. So to encourage a paperless processing of the custom administration, this means that you may have to, in a daily basis, you have to visit your customs electronic portal. You cannot go and tell them that I have not seen that, so whatever show cause notice which you issued, I have not read, so it is time barred. That is not allowed. So you need to be far more tech savvy to know that whether you have any summons or any notice which is served, etc. And investigation by the anti-evasion authorities, whether it is DRI or whether it is DGCI, there is a request from the industry to say that you cannot keep it open forever. It has to have a closure, especially initiation of any kind of audit or any kind of search, seizure, summons, etc. And then the things are dragged for years together, and in the meantime the DRI authorities come and take your money also. So this, they have put a time-bound plan that whenever there is a show cause notice is issued, in this kind of activity of initiation of audit, there has to be an audit closure memo has to be issued within that time period, within 2 years. And if you have a search or a seizure or if you have a summons on some investigation, then within that date of the first receipt of that intimation of those communication, within 2 years, they should have issued a show cause notice and brought the matter to a closure. And this option can be extended by about a year by the Commissioner of Customs. Now coming to the input tax credit availment, this is what I talked about, the restriction of the credit to the extent of whatever maybe those input credit, which is reflecting in the GSTN portal only, can be allowed, can be availed. There is some changes in the zero-rated supplies. Zero-rated supplies means essentially exports and supplies to SEZ developer units, etc. Now in this case, the exports exporters have two options. One is that they can export without payment of duty under a bond and claim the input tax credit, which accumulated input tax credit against that exports as a refund. That is input refund. That is one. Second option is that you can opt to make a payment of IGST on the exported supplies, and whatever IGST you paid on the exports or the zero-rated supply, you can claim the refund of that IGST paid. This will help you to use your input credit, not only the input and input services, but even in the capital goods credit, which is lying unutilized, can also be got refunded from the IGST refund mechanism. These are the two mechanisms which they have provided in the current law. Now they brought a amendment to that. They say that those who are claiming the rebate of GST, input GST, the output GST, it is not that everybody will be in a position to do that. They will notify the the class of taxpayers and the type of supplies of goods and services on which you can claim this benefit under the refund of or rebate mechanism, which I talked about. And again, the supplies to SEZ developer units, etc. There was this confusion. There are some objection taken by the officers to say that when you are claiming this refund, etc., whether these inputs are used for authorized operation or not. So unless and until it is certified by the Development Commissioner Office that these are they are listed the authorized operations, if anything comes falling out of that, then you will not get this benefit. And not only that, in case of sales procedure and supply of goods, supply of services is already there is a restriction. In the case of supply of goods, you should have received the payment for exports within that 9 months to 12 months period, which is allowed under FEMA. And in case if you are not in a position to get the remittance from your buyer abroad within this 30 days from the expiry of 1 year, then you are supposed to refund that benefits claimed along with the interest to the government. One good news is that the cost accountant certification or the chartered accountant certification on the reconciliation statement of GST returns and GST, your books of account, which is under the GSTR 9C. That process is discontinued. Now the government said that you can have a self-certified reconciliation statement, and that could be a part of the annual return submission. So one of the compliance requirement which was troubling many of us is gone. And there is one more scenario, the facility for issuance of C-form. You know that the Central Sales Tax Act and VAT Act and the Excise Act is still alive because petroleum, natural gas, etc. is still not under GST. Now, people are using the Form C route for the purpose of procuring any of those petroleum products, etc. For use in manufacture and sale of GST products. Now, the government has come out with a clarification or an amendment to say that Form C can be issued only if the output is also subject to the old law like VAT and excise. So that facility discontinued. So these are some of the key proposals in this budget, and there also the interest on delayed payment is also now has to be paid only on the net cash liability, which means that if your tax liability, GST liability is 100 rupees and you have a credit about 90 rupees already lying in your input credit account, and if you are delayed the payment of this 100 rupees, then the interest will be levied not on 100 but only 100 minus 90, the net interest live cash outflow. So with this, I over to you, Elias. Thank you.
Sachin. We now move on to a subject which will affect all our personal wallets. I ask Krishnan Narayan to speak to us about direct taxes. Over to you, Krishnan.
Thank you, Elias.
Am I audible, Elias?
Yes.
Absolutely, go ahead.
And are you able to see my screen?
Not yet, Krishnan.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Not really.
Just give me a minute.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
coming
it is
up.
on. It is on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elias. And pardon me for my incompetence on getting this thing on the screen. I think I'm a tax man, so I will look at it from a tax lens. The fine print had 50 pages of finance bill, the operative part dealing with direct taxes. There were about 64 pages of memorandum explaining. So obviously there are some details. But the good thing is, I think everyone was expecting a COVID cess to come and some sort of taxes that taxpayers, all categories have to foot given the pandemic and the additional cost that came. What was very surprising and pleasantly surprising was that the finance minister understood the need for kickstarting the economy, but it was not by taking taxes upfront in some sort of fashion. It was with taking a leap of faith by going with borrowings, spending it on capex and infrastructure, hoping that economy will pick up well and it will eventually dovetail into good tax collections. So that spirit definitely is laudable. It is, I think, welcomed by the stock market, as Elias alluded to. It is an indication of the sentiment of the people. People wanted economy to be picked up, but not by increasing taxes upfront. We'll focus a little on equalization levy, which is a new levy on the block. And I think it is worth discussing this a bit, particularly to this industry where, there are startups and there is a digital angle to it. The opinion within the tax fraternity itself is divided on whether this is a direct tax or an indirect tax. The background to this is that traditionally taxes, international taxes, at least the jurisprudence grew on the basis that unless a foreign party has a physical presence in India, they cannot be taxed on their business income. Now, world over, you had digital tax money getting parked in blue seas or overseas havens where no one was getting their fair share of tax. And today, the developed countries and the developing countries are having a tug of war on who wants to have what share of tax. So the IP holding companies, which are the developed countries, obviously want to tax the lion's share of it. Countries like India, which has got a population of 130 crore and are the consumers and the beneficiaries of some of these products, say, I want my share of tax. So this is the background in which the equalization levy has come into India, because India, as part of G20 and in the digital conversation with OECD, has decided that this is the way they want their share of tax. So what is this equalization levy? It was introduced at 6% on online advertising in 2016. That was only the trailer, so to speak. Come 2020, nothing was discussed during the finance bill, unfortunately. And as the country was going into lockdown on 17 March 20, when the Finance Act was being passed, a neat provision was slipped in, where a 2% levy on consideration received by e-commerce operator from e-commerce supply of services was to be taxed. Now, one can question the manner in which it was introduced, because one would expect in a democracy that a healthy debate happens on a new levy which comes. That didn't happen, and a 2% levy was introduced with effect from 1st April 2020. Now, what was covered in that? Online sale of goods owned by operator, online provision of services provided by operator, online sale of goods or services facilitated by e-commerce operator. And who is an e-commerce operator? A non-resident who owns, operates, or manages a digital or electronic facility. So obviously the burden of this tax is on the non-resident. The compliance relating thereto is also on the non-resident. So far, so good. Given that there was not much material available and a lot of conversations happened, the government was steadfast in its response that the law is very clear and it will apply. There is no need for clarity because it is quite black and white, so to speak. Now, the challenge here is, you may say that when you do an online sale, like for instance, if you're watching a Netflix streaming and you say that the consumer is in India and the non-resident is getting his income from India, even though he has no physical presence in India, he deserves to pay his share of tax in India. So far, so good. But what is online sale of goods was a question mark. And as we understood, online sale means the sale has to happen online and not necessarily anything outside of online. Say, for instance, if you are booking a laptop through a big MNC and bulk orders are being booked and the laptops are physically delivered at a later point in time, is it online sale? Perhaps no was the thinking, but this finance bill has come out and clarified what is online sale of good. They say that even if one or more of the following, that is acceptance of offer of sale, placing purchase order, acceptance of purchase order, even if the payment of consideration or the supply of goods happens to be done online, then it is caught. Now, this effectively means every import in this country will now be subject to equalization levy of 2%. If one were to literally read the law as it is that the intent? We do not know. The constitutional experts will come back and say, if you want to levy 2% as EL on every import, then what is customs duty for? Can customs duty and EL coexist simultaneously? Big question mark. Again, for the e-commerce operators who are only a marketplace, they get their commission between the price to the buyer and the price at which it comes through the seller. Now, the assumption, at least through the last 9-10 months, was that the e-commerce facilitator should be taxed equalization levy only on his commission or the margin. Now, they have come out with a clarification saying that consideration means value of goods and services, regardless of whether the ownership or facilitation is by the e-commerce operator. So again, the intent or the wish list of the government clearly is to say, I want to tax 2% on the entire sales piece. Now, this can have wide ramifications for non-residents. If the budget had not planned for tax inflows, this might be an unexpected bonanza if all of them decide to comply the law, given the letter of the law the way it is. There was another catch. Typically, in the software and IT industry, many people for shrink-wrapped software or copyrighted article which they are importing, they don't believe that it is income tax is payable to the non-resident and withholding to happen. As we speak today, the matter is now in the Supreme Court. It was to come up for hearing today morning. It has got adjourned to 9th of February. Now, the law on software as royalty under income tax is still a question mark. The Supreme Court has not adjudicated. Now, what happened last year when they said that equalization levy comes? Many non-residents said, okay, I don't want to subject myself to software royalty. I'll pay 2% equalization levy, and it only strengthens my case to say that copyrighted article which I supply is not subject to income tax as royalty. Now, when the tax department got wind of it, they said, no, we are still contesting that it is taxable. So very promptly, if another amendment comes this time to the effect that, equalization levy, if equalization levy applies, income tax is exempt. But the catch or the exception is that if that is taxable as royalty or fees for technical services, then income tax will apply and not equalization levy. So very clearly, the government is saying, if I as between 10% and 2%, if I win the Supreme Court case, I want to reserve my right to tax 10%. If I lose, then I will still tax 2% equalization levy from you. So it's a case of heads I win, tails you lose, kind of. So I think we need to watch this space on equalization levy very carefully because, constitutional validity of it, the impact on non-residents with whom we do business. As you are aware, Apple said that, if this equalization levy they have to foot, they will bill it on customers in India and they'll pass on the burden to the Indian customer. So eventually the ultimate cost to the end user might go up. Again, US Trade Council is up in arms saying that this is an arbitrary tax, not in line with international tax jurisprudence. India is saying no, this is in line with OECD and G20 discussion on digital taxation. So India has also gone back and said, we don't agree with you. So there is a lot of tug of war and posturing happening on this. Eventually, I think that the world is moving towards, the consumer state saying, I want my share of tax. And these are one of the many measures to say, I want my fair share of the pound of flesh. So this broadly is equalization levy where we stand. There are more questions than answers, even from the tax experts. So, bear with me as I discuss these, because there is only so much jurisprudence available. But clearly, India, amongst many countries on digital taxation, has taken the first step forward on how it wants to tax. Let's look at some TDS proposals. I mean, these may be compliance procedures, but it's important to highlight. Last year, they bought tax collected at source on sale of goods at 0.1%. They also bought 194O, which was applicable to e-commerce operator. You'd be surprised to know that a location like Karnataka and Goa has got more direct tax collection than even North India, at least until Q3, purely because of the collections which came in from these two provisions. It was an unexpected bonanza. I think enthused with that, they are now saying they want 0.1% TDS on purchase of goods. So the condition is that if the turnover of the buyer is more than 10 crores in the preceding year, the goods purchased from the seller exceeds 50 lakhs in a year, then the purchaser has to do a TDS of 0.1%, as an agent of the government. Now, this 0.1% can go up to 5% if the seller doesn't give a PAN. And there is an interplay here, because the purchaser will deduct TDS 0.1% on purchase. The seller will deduct tax collection at source, of 0.1% on the sale. So as between TCS and TDS on that, the TDS provision under 194Q will prevail. They've also introduced some, interesting provisions on higher TDS. They say that if the seller has not been filing return for immediately 2 previous years, and where the TDS and the TCS collection is more than 50,000 in the 2 previous years, the TDS to be levied by the payer is 2x the applicable rate, or 5%, whichever is higher. And as between TDS and TCS, you take the higher of the two, compare it with 5% and levy. Now, no harm, given that the department's contention is many people don't pay advance tax and they want their fair share of tax. But let's reflect back and think, if as a payer you are an agent of the government, to what extent should you do the duty of the tax administrator? How do you expect the payer to go and find out whether the seller has filed his income tax return for the previous 2 years? And whether, because if you don't apply the law correctly and apply the correct rate, the payer is a taxpayer in default and has to cough up the shortfall in tax. To me, that looks onerous. If you really want to garner more taxes, maybe you can take out the rigor of default in the hands of the payer to some extent. Otherwise, you land up, thrashing the fellow who's actually the agent of the government in this case. So I thought this was very important to bring out, because the government now is moving more towards having a better mechanism to have TDS and tax collection at source, because they find that they're getting better collection. At the end of the day, when the income earner files a return and showcases his position, they may give a refund if it is due. Otherwise, their collection looks good. Again, the theme of this time's budget was to simplify assessment and procedures. And as you can see, the time limits are now slowly getting truncated. So time limit for filing revised return and late returns is now 9 months from the end of the financial year. So typically, if your due date is 30th November after the end of the financial year to file your return, you have only 1 more month left to revise or file late return, not beyond that. If your tax audit report shows items of disallowance or income and it's not considered in your return, in your intimation, automatically those adjustments will be done by the CPC. Time limit for issuing notice for assessment is now reduced by 3 months. So, within 15 months from the end of the financial year, you will get a notice. So if your if you're talking about year ended March 21, you will get a notice not later than 30th June 22. Time limit for reopening assessment. Now, this was mentioned in the finance minister's speech, saying that we are trying to reduce the limit for reopening matters. So the reference is 3 years from the end of the assessment year or 6 years from the end of the assessment year. I have stuck in the slides to end of the financial year. So 4 years from the end of the financial year is what is being reduced from 5 to 7 years. This requires the principal commissioner's approval. So there are safeguards there. But hitherto, and reopening could happen 6 years from the end of the assessment year. Now it can also happen up to 10 years from the end of the assessment year if there is evidence of income escaping assessment in excess of 50 lakhs in the form of asset. So while we are talking at one end of simplifying and truncating, there is also the other side that, if there is something which the tax officer suspects is more than 50 lakhs, the 6 year has gone to 10 years. Actually, the scope has widened in that sense, and we must not lose sight of that. I think the only saving grace is that before the officer initiates an action, he needs the permission of the principal chief commissioner, even a level higher than the principal commissioner. So we hope that that will be used discreetly and judiciously. Again, time limit for completing assessments have been truncated by 3 months. So, if for this financial year 2021, if you have a transfer pricing matter, it has to be completed by December 23. In other cases, it will get over by December 22. So you will get a notice not later than June 22, and your case assessment should get completed by December 22. Again, in line with transparency, and the Prime Minister himself has said that he does not want too much of interaction between taxpayers and the authorities. He wants a transparent digital system. In line with faceless assessments and faceless CIT appeals, now the tribunal is also going into a faceless mode. I mean, you can have all sorts of criticism on it, saying that you need a face-to-face hearing in all cases and so on and so forth. But everyone resists change. When we had e-filing, everyone of the return, everyone complained, but it settled in 2-3 years. If this is implemented well, I'm sure the faceless ITAT scheme will also do well. And they have left a provision to say wherever a personal hearing is needed, it shall be through a video conferencing. So, a lot of time, energy, hotel expenses can be saved, to travel across the length and breadth of the country and then get an adjournment and come back again. So hopefully it's a good move. If it is implemented well, I think it will ease administration significantly. The next one is the authority for advance ruling. I think that is proposed to be abolished. An AR is presided by a retired Supreme Court judge to hear a transaction in advance. That is, before the transaction is consummated, to understand the tax implications and to have certainty. Now, obviously, those vacancies were not being filled and there was a big pendency. So they are doing away with AR. All pending matters will now go to a board of advance ruling, and it will comprise of 2 chief commissioners who will preside over it. Now, here is the catch. The ruling of that board can be appealed to High Court by both parties. Now, it begs the question, then why do you need an advance ruling? Because if both parties can go and appeal to the High Court, then what certainty are we trying to achieve through the advance ruling? So that appears to be a case of missing the wood for the trees. Hopefully, it has to be made binding at some level. Otherwise, there's no point in going for an advance ruling at one level. Again, the theme is to cut down a dispute without possibly going to the appellate authority. So a dispute resolution committee is proposed to be constituted for medium and small taxpayers. What is the threshold? Returned income is less than 50 lakhs. Income adjustment is less than 10 lakhs. And if you go there, it is at the option of the taxpayer. The authorities who will adjudicate will have powers to, reduce penalty, give immunity from prosecution. Of course, some search, seizure matters and, information coming from a treaty partner, etc., will not be covered under this mechanism once it's picked up. So again, the theme is, can we nip litigation or potential litigation in the bud? And I think in the spirit of that, it is a very welcome move. We talked about startups. So the startups are enjoying a tax holiday 3 out of 10 years. And the turnover last year, if you recall, the threshold was increased from 25 crores to 100 crores. Now, those eligible startups were supposed to be incorporated before 1st April 21. That has been extended by 1 year. If somebody is selling off residential property, an individual or an HUF, and putting the money in the startup, the capital gains from the sale of that property now it has been extended to 31st March 22. I think the biggest item on the direct tax, which came as a surprise, was goodwill arising from business reorganizations. I think there was for those who do not know, there was a Supreme Court decision which said that goodwill is eligible for business depreciation, tax depreciation. Obviously, the tax department doesn't agree with that. And given the Supreme Court wording, they decided that with effect from this year, and I'm talking about 2021 financial year, they said depreciation is not available on goodwill. It may be a purchased goodwill, it may be on account of a business reorganization, but you are not entitled to goodwill depreciation anymore. Now, on an acquired goodwill, if you have claim depreciation, it will be removed from the block. The rules are yet to come. But tomorrow, when you sell that goodwill to another party, under the block concept, it will be treated as short-term gain. But you will not get to the extent your claim depreciation, your cost block will get reduced. So they clearly laid out that this is not available. They have clearly in the memorandum said it is applicable from 2021 financial year. So if you have worked out your advance tax factoring the goodwill break, you will have to revisit your advance tax for the last quarter and make good the shortfall coming out of it. Advance tax on dividend income now is on par with capital gains. The assumption is that a taxpayer cannot visualize how much dividend the company in which they have invested will declare. So you have to include it in your advance tax only after the dividend is declared. Again, tax audit thresholds have been increased from 5 crores to 10 crores, provided 95% of the transactions are in non-cash mode. There was always this debate of employees' contribution, whether it should be allowed if it is paid beyond the due date, but before filing of tax return. The department has stated its position that employer contribution and employee contribution are not on a par. Employee contribution first becomes income and gets deductible if you pay it in the due date. And it is not for a company to hold back that money till the due date of filing return to pay. So they have clearly laid out, there were some court decisions which said that even the employee's contribution can be allowed if it is paid by the due date of filing return. They say no, as under the Employee Provident Fund Act, whatever is the due date, if you pay it, you get the deduction. Otherwise, you lose the deduction because you're not supposed to carry the employee's money with you for your working capital beyond the stipulated due date. On personal taxation, again, good news is there is no news. So that is good news. For ULIP policies, clearly investment and insurance products, they're saying after 1st February 21, if the premium exceeds 250,000, you will not get the tax exemption under section 1010D. For leave travel concession, this block is ending, the leave travel block is ending in 21. It is 2018 to 21. Given the pandemic, many people could not avail of it. So they say, in lieu of LTC, if you or your family member purchases any product from a registered GST vendor with a GST tax rate of 12%, then you get either 1/3 of it or 36,000 rupees, whichever is less. Again, senior citizens above 75 years, they have said that you can be exempted from filing a return. But the catch is you should only have pension income, and the interest income must also be in that pension account with that bank only and not beyond. So not sure how many will get covered, but it is an attempt to ease the burden of senior citizen for their status. Again, the finance minister mentioned this even post-budget that many employees are putting huge amount in employee provident fund and getting huge interest at 8%, which is tax-free. So they have said that any contribution up to 250,000, the interest will be eligible for tax exemption, not beyond. They've also mentioned other provident funds. So public provident fund is included, but in any case under public provident fund, if you invested in an account more than 150,000, anyway, the interest they were not paying on it. Again, for affordable residents, the interest loan under 80 EEA, they have extended it by 1 more year to 31st March 22. So in summary, again, largely expenditure-driven exercise, significant outlays on capital, healthcare infrastructure. Direct tax rate has been kept constant. Government is borrowing heavily and hoping that the economy kickstarts and we will get the rewards of a buoyant economy. That can be anybody's guess which way it will go, but surely if it is implemented well, there is something to look forward to amidst the troubles that all of us have gone through in the last year. Tax change in the finance bill, again, the focus is now on compliance, using digital and AI to catch non-compliance, cut out dispute resolution, but provisions like TDS on purchase of goods put consequences for default, which make it onerous for the agent of the government. Equalization levy, new animal on the block, jury on it is not out yet. Several industry demands were not addressed, like people wanted the corporate tax rate of 15% on manufacturing to extend to service. They wanted SEZ reserves to be used for working capital given the difficult times. Some rules were wanted on work from home relaxation on the direct and indirect tax front. Significant economic presence, again, a brainchild of OECD G20 conversation. It is effective 1st April, but no guidelines are out on how it will apply. Depreciation on goodwill is a dampener. It will affect past transaction and the IRR. It will affect indemnities. So you can expect some action on, and on some hue and cry on that. As expected, healthcare, well-being, infrastructure found center stage. Direct tax proposal, tax rates are unaltered. Focus is on increased collection through better management and compliance, and try to cut down litigation with an effective dispute resolution mechanism. So that broadly sums the direct tax provision. There are fine details. If there are any specific issues, we can have a chat on that. Back to Elias.
Thanks, Krishnan. So we have a hard close at 7 o'clock. Suppose we can spend about 10 minutes on Q&A if there are any questions.
So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A tab, if you can take them first.
Do you want to sort of read them out one by one? Nirmal, is that a good idea?
Sure. First question is from Akhil Lucas. He asks, one of the most awaited announcement was the introduction of a national digital currency, which didn't happen. There's still no clear regulations with respect to the crypto or digital currencies in India, whereas other countries are progressing quite well. When can we expect clarity in this space? Does anyone want to take that?
That's a tough one. I was wondering.
I think the silence says it all. Possibly, one, possibly none of us is a digital currency expert, and two, in any case, from whatever I hear and read, there still is some more clarity required on this for people to have a view.
Yeah, I think there is no visibility at all on that policy landscape, frankly. Not sure if government India is thinking on those lines yet.
Sure. The next question is from Mr. Mahalingamar. How will we verify the sellers have filed IT returns?
You're absolutely right, Mr. Mahalingam. Which is what I was alluding to. If as a TDS deductor, if you are an agent of the government, what is the extent to which you are expected to, discharge your duties? I think a healthy debate is warranted on it. The only silver lining here is in the memorandum they have said, we have if there are difficulties, we will come with procedure rules to address that. So we will give them the benefit of doubt for now. They may come with some thresholds on how you can determine whether the seller has filed IT returns. But a purchaser cannot go on an investigation spree on whether the seller has filed IT returns. The seller might say, I'm not answerable to you, but maybe getting a declaration to comply with this law will possibly be the only way out as a starting point. But let us see what they come out in the rules as what is palatable. We will reserve judgment and criticism till that time.
Okay, to add on to that question is, with regards to EL, what is meant by online? If I provide a remote support through internet, is it considered online?
So,
It's again his question.
online is defined in equalization, maybe, by the way. It means a facility or service or right or benefit or access that is obtained through the internet or any other form of digital or telecommunication network, which means it covers everything. It can even cover email. Only going back to the Mughal age where you could tie a message to the leg of a pigeon and pass on the message, that is not covered. Otherwise, today everything is online. And the way they have worded it, they have said any limb of it, even if you make the payment online, even if you do the purchase booking online, even if you, placement of the order online, everything is, any limb which has got an element of online is online. And the definition of online covers every form of digital or telecommunication network. So even a phone call, telex, everything is covered. They have defined online also in the law. So my only answer to is what is not online is sending a purchase order with a message tied to the leg of a pigeon. That is the only one which is not covered. So we have to really see what is the scope and extent of this law, to what extent the government is willing to give relaxation. The mood that they are in, they are saying we are covering everything. Now you come back and say what you are going to comply, then we will come to the discussion table.
The next question is from Tushar Matthew. He's checking whether worst hit sectors like airlines, tourism, hospitality, restaurants, are there any signs of revival for these sectors? Or has there been any assumption that these can manage of their own with an assumption of V-shaped recovery?
So quickly addressing that, I think largely the view of the ministry has been, and what we've seen in the last quarter of the calendar year is that the tourism sector and aviation sector has picked up. Just to give you recent figures from the DGCA, the airline traffic is up to about 70% of pre-COVID times. Now, certain territories have been doing very well. For example, Goa witnessed one of the largest footfalls ever for their new year. So we have seen some states and some regions that, as far as the tourism and restaurant, hospitality, aviation, see some amount of growth. Again, hotel occupancies across the chart in the last quarter were close to about 70-75%, which is only 5% lesser than the average in pre-COVID areas. So we are seeing that recovery as far as the sector-specific packages are concerned. See, this is, even though tourism is one of the largest sectors which provides employment, and it provides a lot of economic activity, allied economic activity also. As I mentioned in my analysis of the budget also, the thought process of the government is to stress on 3 sectors, which will form the backbone of our probably this decade's entire development, which is healthcare, infrastructure, and agriculture. So therefore, the entire budget has been put in that, all the SOPs, if you would say, have been put in that bucket for this year. And I think going forward with the kind of recovery that we are seeing, and especially with the growth of domestic tourism, this industry should recover very well. And I see major green shoots everywhere if you would look at this industry in totality. So from our perspective, we're very bullish as far as the entire sector is concerned.
Thank you. There's a question from Mr. Alex Anthony who asks, is it advisable for professionals to start a one-man company as per the latest rules?
So, sir, you want to answer that or you want me to go reply? Elias, I will take a shot. You're on mute, yeah.
Hi, Krishna. Yeah.
See, again, you're talking about a professional. So if it's a one-man show, then obviously you're not into an LLP kind of thing. I would say a limited liability partnership is good. Unlimited liability partnership is not the way to go because your personal assets can be questioned, particularly if you're an auditor. There's no end to the troubles that can come your way if something goes wrong. So I would say that one-man company, definitely the provisions are easy. Hitherto, if your paid up capital was 50 lakhs or more than 2 crores, you have to compulsorily convert to a private or a public company. Now you can remain a one-man company with lesser compliance, obviously with the limited liability of the capital you put in. So it is definitely an alternative to an LLP. Again, there are decriminalizations of technical procedural compoundable offenses. Companies Act already has progressed favorably. They are wanting to do that even for LLP. So definitely that's an option to be weighed with LLP, and you can choose what you want to do. They've clearly said you can convert to a company whenever you want to. They've said the thresholds have come down from 182 days to 120 days if you're not a citizen of India within the residence. So I think let's wait for some more clarification and rules to come from the company affairs on this. Then you now have a choice of one-man company versus LLP to choose from if you're a professional.
Another question in the hospitality sector is from Ranjana. What is the future of restaurant business in the current budget, which was badly affected during the pandemic?
So largely, the outlook as far as budget is concerned, there is no specific provision which has changed. So we are what we were in the pre-COVID era as far as taxation and any other incentives are concerned. Of course, a lot of states including Kerala had given packages to bail out the ailing industry during the COVID times. But from a larger perspective, I think restaurants, hotels, everything is going to do well when people, when the vaccine rollout is happening. And the heartening thing is that the government has put the money where the mouth is. Government has made substantial allocation as far as vaccine and healthcare is concerned. So once people start getting vaccinated, once we have the herd immunity, which all of us have been hearing about, I think people would be out and about. And given all this pent up demand which is there from domestic market specifically, I think restaurants and hotels have a very good outlook as far as the next few years are concerned, both from a domestic perspective and as far also from an international perspective. Because people who have been traveling internationally, we've seen that they are now exploring more and more of India. So it is a good thing for our domestic market to get a fillip. And also people who've not been able to travel to India till now, who've been postponing it, would now, ensure that they travel to India as soon as possible, given how, a pandemic or any such event changes our entire mindset. So I think it is a good time for all of us in the coming years.
Thank you, Alap. Any more questions from participants?
There is one question, Nirmal, from Sudhakaran Nair in the chat box. Can you please read it out? That can be the last.
Sure. Okay, Mr. Sudhakaran Nair says that the budget is devoid of microeconomic measures. Is it too loaded on macroeconomic measures? The second question is the stock market buoyant on good indicators of the buoyant economy?
I don't know who wants to have a go at those. These are philosophical questions. So,
I can go at it, Elias.
Go ahead, MSA.
Mr. Nair has asked is the right question, because we are not seen any history. Like today also, the market went up by almost 1% plus. So since the budget was presented, it's almost close to 10%, 8.5%, 9% increase in the stock market. But is it a reflection of the economy? Definitely not. See, we always say the Wall Street versus the Main Street. There is a kind of a lack of linkages, and that's what is happening here. But stock market is definitely on the boom, basically because of the higher liquidity in the international market, as well as the low interest rates. Plus a good budget. I mean, let's not take it away, but that cannot be a reflection of the economy. Now, coming to the microeconomic versus macroeconomy, see, they have believed highly on the trickle-down theory. There cannot be elimination of poverty or the vulnerable sections of the society there are two schools of thought. I mean, it's highly debatable which is right. But at the end of the day, the current government has taken the route of creating wealth first, and then that will trickle down. For example, the high outlay on the infrastructure is going to have a big multiplier effect, as Alap told about tourism or road construction or other infrastructure projects will have a high multiplier effect. So that way, I agree that immediately there is no impact of the budget, but for a period of time, we'll start feeling hopefully. Of course, the budget maths is dependent a great a lot on the disinvestment target which is taken by the Honorable Finance Minister. We have to wait and see, because last year was a total flop on the disinvestment target. If you recall, I think we are not done more than 25,000 crores, right, disinvestment. So this year she has taken a target of 1,75,000 crores, but hopefully it should be done, because LIC itself will be a big, with a market cap of 12 to 15 lakh crores. Even if 10% they privatize, it will be a big sum. So let us hope for the best on the maths of the budget.
Well said, MSA. As you said, this budget is very unusual in the scope of its ambition. So let's see how the implementation works forward. Thanks, MSA. I think that's over to you.
Yeah, I think we had a great session, Elias and team. Wonderful, lot of new learnings, and I mean, of course, within this limited time of 48 hours, KPMG team has done a wonderful analysis. It has been very eye-opening for many of our members on taxes, and one of the members put that interest to be paid on delayed GST is net of input tax credit. I mean, these are all very, very finer points for a budget which will help us than one-person company, what Krishnan explained. So it's all very good. Thanks a lot, Elias and team. Thanks a lot for a wonderful productive evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, participants. Thank you.